I'd like to welcome everybody to our panel on the geopolitical implications of energy shifts. I'm Stephan Richter, based in Washington, D.C., and I run an online magazine there called The Globalist. We have a fantastic panel for you, and mostly want to do a conversation initially amongst us and then with you in the participating audience. And when we talk about geostrategic implications, my operating hypothesis for our panel today is that when you look at energy and what it means for the future of humanity in a strategic context, then whatever we're going to say is also a Rorschach test on the speakers themselves, because energy has a wonderful way of inserting itself into many aspects of humanity far beyond BTUs and other statistics, which make it very interesting. If you read the newspapers in the last couple of days, for example, there is new evidence now from the natural scientists that the bluefin tuna that usually spawn in Japan and that are eaten at high price as sushi and sashimi tuna in California and in Japan itself are now showing a lot of radiation levels that have to do with the fact that they spawn just off the coast of Fukushima, usually, and travel with energy in their bodies and wreck sashimi. If you look at where we are here in Poland today, having a global conference in Wroclaw, I think it is fascinating to reinterpret the shale gas story. Because shale gas, in a way, is used by the United States government as a very interesting diplomatic initiative to realign nations that have gotten unaligned. There's a big initiative into Africa and all over, but in Europe, the US strategy isn't working quite so well, because even in Poland, there is a lot of resistance to the topic, not just in the usual places like Germany and France. And we can go on and on this. Another thing that fascinates me is the German government, which has announced to exit out of nuclear via the nuclear scientist Angela Merkel, or physicist Angela Merkel, who's also the chancellor. And no sooner did the Germans announce that than there was a lot of doubt in the global energy field as to whether the Germans could ever pull off what in history they've always done, which is to be pretty good to take scientific approaches and marry them with systemic challenges. If there's one core competence of the German industry, then maybe that's it. And people don't understand that Europe, for once, is running a fully hedged position on this, because obviously the Germans and a few other nations are going post-nuclear, and the German neighbors to the west, the French, are all in nuclear still. I mean, there are some details in that country about debating it, but Europe seems to have a good energy portfolio. People who push nuclear, people who push anti-nuclear and stuff like that. The way I want to run our panel initially is to ask our three participants up here first for what is the either biggest surprise to them or the thing that they didn't know as little as a year ago. And I want to start with that question to Matt Hulbert, who has the benefit that he's British and therefore has a genetic claim on the longest energy imperialism yield management. So what's different to you? What should we all hear from you that will surprise us over the next year or 5 years that none of us is seeing right now?
Thanks, Stephan. I think the thing that I would point out in terms of the next year, next 5 years, even next 10 years, is despite a lot of the headlines we read that we're about to enter a very bountiful world of energy, actually the next decade is going to be very, very fraught in terms of how we actually get there. And I think we're going to see enormous volatility in between. In terms of the transition we'll often hear in Europe, what we tend to think about is shifting from a hydrocarbon economy to a low-carbon economy and clean tech. Unfortunately, this is not really the transition that's playing out. It's actually we're transiting towards a far more dirty world, and principally that's because of no-OECD growth in Asia. If you consider this, the Chinese and the Indian economy will both double in size by 2020. Chinese coal consumption went up 9% last year. global coal mix has gone up 25% to 30% as well. So the idea that we had at Durban that we'd somehow agreed to discuss in 2015 what we might do about carbon by 2020, I would argue that in that sense we're going to go from a world of mitigation of climate towards adaptation. So the horse has already bolted. But I think what that really links into in terms of the growth economies of Asia is the real transition we're seeing right now, and that's from one, ultimately, of Western consumption to Eastern consumption. And this is where the main geopolitical shifts actually start to play out from that. The Chinese are going to have exactly the same import dependency problem that the US have had post-war. Whether that's going to be 70%, 80%, 90%, it doesn't really matter in terms of the geopolitical resonance because it's going to be the same problem. Now, the good news is I think a few years ago we'd have all said we were heading for a major geopolitical car crash because the idea was that the US and the Chinese were going to be in fierce competition for every last drop of oil. Now, the great news is that the US has obviously just gone through its huge shale revolution, and it could well do the same in terms of shale oil. So what that's done, and it's not just in the US, obviously that's a lot of unconventional plays everywhere, Brazil, Argentina, Canada, you name it. What that's done is opened up policy space for us to rethink exactly what we're going to do in terms of securing a long-term energy future in what we could coin, and has been coined, the G2 relationship. The problem is, so far, we're not even close to working out a hydrocarbon division of labour. And this is very, very problematic, and especially in the key producing region of the world that will continue to be that for the next decade, in the Middle East. We've all seen from the Arab awakening, it's clearly now turning into a Salafist seance, which is particularly concerning. That's before we even consider the Iranian nuclear question, which I really think highlights, we can come on to it later, where the gap between where the US are at and where the Chinese are at in terms of security of supply rests. We have a systemic problem now in the Middle East that you have a geological cost of production and we have a geopolitical cost of survival. And those two things are not even close to aligned anymore. You have a massive spread on that, basically from anything from $5 a barrel in Saudi all the way up to $100 to actually sustain regimes of key exporting states. That's going to be problematic.
Except for all the nations there, right? The $100 level is what they need for their youth revolution prevention budget.
That is exactly correct, yeah. All the social spending, all the sovereign wealth money that we thought was going to be flowing out of the Middle East is now staying very much at home. So that's the real dissonance there. OPEC's second big problem here, which we see as a good thing, they see as a very bad thing, of course, is security of demand. If the United States is genuinely going to become the world's largest oil producer by 2017, if it's going to be producing 22 million barrels of oil a day in the next couple of decades, if we assume that North Dakota is already bigger than Ecuador, that's a very large question mark as to whether anybody in Riyadh or Kuwait or anywhere else will be making the kind of investments they would have done in a kind of business as usual scenario. So I think things could get very, very tight there in terms of investment flows that we're going to need to see. We're also seeing this now play out in Russia. And so in terms of the OPEC, non-OPEC divide, I think that's really dying down now. It's purely between producers and consumers, and both ways that plays out. I think the Russians have been caught napping. They're desperately now trying to play catch-up with a new Putin presidency. We're seeing lots of deals potentially going into the Arctic. It's all very, very early days there. But as far as the Russians are concerned, oil is the money, gas is the power. And I think the gas element is where we kind of drill straight down into the European outlook. And you do get derided for saying this, but I really don't think that the Europeans have really woken up to the realities and the geopolitical realities that are unfolding around us as to how we're going to secure an energy future. A lot of that flows out from the US position that they think they're going energy independent. We saw it over Libya. Washington rightfully said, look guys, this is your problem, you sort it out. I don't think that would have happened if the US weren't sitting quite as pretty as they would have been in terms of hydrocarbon abundance, say, a decade ago. The second version I think we're now seeing as well is in Iran. The bottom line is that the United States see nuclear containment as a higher priority than oil price volatility. I'd say would not have gone down this path if that wasn't the case. So Europe really does need to think about its plan B. And I would say, even though we're at Atlantic Council Forum, the plan B for Europe actually is increasingly looking at both ends of the Eurasian pipeline, and that means China, because we are going to be sharing exactly the same core supplier in natural resources, and it's Russia. That could have potentially very large fringe benefits in terms of European access to Central Asia, not because we will win it, but because maybe the Chinese would be benevolent enough to give it to us, precisely because that works well for them vis-à-vis the Russians. So there's a real kind of triangulation play coming out there. And I think within that as well, this is something to really ponder, because if you look at the entire global map, it's not inconceivable that what we see is a total divorce between the Atlantic Basin and the Pacific Basin. So America, North America gets Canada, the Americas, a little bit of West African production for good measure. China, they get Middle East, Central Asia, Russia, Australasia, and East Africa. You literally split the world in two. Personally, I think it's going to be more messy than that because I think private sector companies are far too smart to fall for that kind of thing. They want to hedge and arbitrage globally. Great news, we're seeing Chinese investment heavily in North America and vice versa. But the key thing is we need here, and I think this is particularly incumbent on the United States, is if they are generally as energy rich as we are claiming, a lot of that has to become export markets. Otherwise, this is all going to end very badly indeed, particularly for the Europeans. And where we're currently at right now, we've just played our hand on Iran, and we've probably just lost. The US, the second that the gasoline price in the US went above $4 a gallon, it was straight back to square one, plead to the Saudis to put more oil on the market, and by the way, you just totally politicised the use of the strategic reserve of the IEA. So we're not in a good place. I think to conclude on that, so we're going to see a very, very volatile decade. We need to think seriously about how we're going to handle OPEC. We seriously need China to step up as a kind of geostrategic plan B. And if we make it to the 2020s, 2030s, when we are as abundant as we think we are, that might be very good geopolitically, but what we'll have gone from is a warmer world to one where we're going to certainly incinerate ourselves.
Thank you very much, Matt. That was a lot to chew on. Turning to Ed, the question is, in the US, we talk about high oil prices for the consumer, and of course, any European can only laugh about that, and so can any Mexican, Nigerian, Indonesian, and so on, where in real terms, not adjusting for per capita income, the oil price in most of these places is actually higher than in the US. So it's a country that where the consumer depends on cheap oil, and the politics is often geared to that. If we extend that by one more notch, there is, as Matt made clear, and as I think most of us up here would, and in the audience would share, a lot of energy optimism in the United States. What I wonder about is, at the same time in the US, we have a big debate that post the Facebook revolution, where we're not doing so well on a lot of technology issues. The United States used to be a great power on energy technology, and yet with cheap energy being available now, are we also turning into a technology retrograde nation? Because obviously a lot of the future energy and environment investments that are needed are off the table in terms of the ROI that's needed for it. And do you worry about that in terms of the US, or what is your biggest worry? I don't want to talk about the hype. We've all read about the hype about the US going independent, but I'd like to hear from you, with your background, having been at Chevron and so on. What worries you in a global context about the current US outlook on these issues?
Probably the last thing will worry me is the US falling behind technologically on energy. I think we have proven over time that we have a very robust ability to adapt to new conditions. The shale gas revolution being the most obvious example of that. And it was not driven by large US companies, so scale was not what drove it. In the US at the beginning, it was driven by small, innovative, nimble companies that were experimenting on new ways of doing things. The US has a mix in the industry between service companies, small and independent producers, that's really not duplicated anywhere else in the world, certainly at that scale. It wasn't the ExxonMobils and the Chevrons that drove the shale gas technology. It was the small independent companies out of Oklahoma and Texas that did that. It was driven by economics. It was driven by $13 gas. Now we have $2.50 or less gas per million BTU. So I think we've demonstrated that not only in basic R&D that the government supports and academic institutions are involved in, but also in adapting new technology that no, that's not something that I would worry about.
I think I should have been a little more specific. I think I wasn't clear enough. Clearly, in terms of energy technology, the US is always looking for a good return on the buck and is doing the best job with risk-taking. The flip side, you can't talk about energy in a global context and in a futures context without talking about the environmental consequences. And what I meant more specifically then is, with US ingenuity in energy technologies being the way they are, aren't we seriously risking that in terms of the other side of the equation, environmental technologies, they are facing a much harder time these days in the US, not just because of political scandals, but investment cycles, 30-year horizons and so on, which is something that, to me at least, it seems the US is doing a far less good job on than on exploiting things that you can bring to the market tomorrow.
Well, but there was always false political expectations to begin with. Mm-hmm. And the energy transformation, and I have to, confess that I'm a recovering oil and gas man, so I come from that traditional energy background, was always going to take decades. It wasn't something that is achievable in 5-10 years. And it's not achievable by using, as I think Alan pointed out at yesterday's panel, using 20th century or 19th century technology. It's going to take a lot longer, measured in many decades, than is conceivable given the political targets set in Europe or the United States. The President of the United States came in thinking that it was going to take 2-3 years, now understanding that it's going to take 2-3 decades. So you've seen the Obama rhetoric shift completely to all of the above now on energy supply. We have done a lot in terms of driving efficiency in the United States, and driven mainly by price, but also by mandates such as we are seeing in automobile efficiency. So on both the supply and demand side, I would say, the US have done quite a bit. It doesn't do it necessarily through government mandates that you see in other parts of the world. And maybe that's harder to see. It's interesting to me that in a long-term industry with long cycles, that politicians are always fighting the last war, worse than generals do. And the volatility that Matthew talked about earlier is going to be volatility fundamentally going down in pricing, not up in pricing, and yet politicians, including in some of yesterday's conversations, are worried about yesterday's war, not the future. Brent fell below $100 this morning. It's heading inevitably down to 80, perhaps lower. Now, it will have blips up and down again, but we just went through 10 years of a cycle that started with below $20 oil. And we're just beginning to see the effects of this because there's a lag in demand and supply response. A lot of things that we're seeing today as a result of the long cycle.
Great. Thank you very much. Now, Jacek is a man with a split personality. All of you Poles may not know that yet, but he gets 2 questions from me for that. To me, he is first a Pole, and he should be very proud of it. And I say that as somebody who not only has lived in Washington for 30 years, but somebody who still has a German passport. And I think the Poles have a lot to be proud of these days. And the second question is going to be to you as a European, which is the identity you really want to focus on. In the Polish context, if you look over the last 20, 30 years, 40 years, what I find fascinating is that one can look at Polish psychology and self-confidence and the energy issue in a very correlated sense. It used to be, again in a Washington context, and you can make the case even in the form of the current foreign minister of this country, who was, when he was in Washington, very much a, shall we put it very kindly, strong supporter of the American view of transatlantic issues. I think there are harder ways one could put this. And today he is a perfectly balanced, true European leader who can articulate a Polish European view and who has increasingly doubts about the United States in various ways. And I've seen that play out in the energy issue, including on shale gas, where everybody would have expected that the Poles of the past would have just fallen lock, stock, and barrel for the American view, go gung-ho for it, and it's not how the domestic debate here is playing out. I don't want us to get, in the first instance here, get lost in the energy weeds of this, but as a Pole, is there truth to the suggestion that Polish self-confidence and a more balanced view on not even being so phobic about Russia and all these things anymore is a sign that the energy field is a reflection of well-deserved Polish confidence based on past economic performance?
The brief answer is no. Our self-confidence is based on belonging to the European Union. We have been victim of dependency on energy from Soviet Union in the old times, and that has shifted towards the present times when we are in NATO and in the European Union. That's why we are the most vocal proponents in the European Union of depolitizing energy and calling for eliminating energy as a political weapon and blackmail tool as it is applied by Russia. So we look on the energy shifts, which are the title of this session, much more in terms of geographic shifts, who delivers to whom and under what conditions, than to this energy mix approach, which was dominant in my co-panelists' presentation. Something which is to a certain degree also the view now of the Union, European Union as a whole. European Union would like to see the energy going back to the state of commodity and not a political weapon. And for that reason, we need a regulatory framework. And this is the third package. This is the principles which we are trying to propose under various agreements to our Eastern partners, including Russia. And something which one day, I hope, would lead to a regulatory framework established on the global level. But for the moment, we see that Poland, European Union, and the West, because the West is in the title of this conference. Conference speaks about reinventing the West, and this session is about powering the future. I would reverse this. I would say that we have to reinvent the future in energy and empower the West, to make the West independent from the pressures from Arab countries, from Russia and others who want to dictate political conditions to us. And that already happens because there's a kind of a democratization of the energy market because new entrants go there. I mean, non-OECD countries are on the, and it was just described. And at the same time, there's a shift in terms of new sources, shale gas, which you did mention, but also it is not only, as you said, that America is trying to help or to suggest to others to dig into this new possibility, but by the very fact that America is much less dependent on energy because of the shale gas, it already changes the landscape. And it's a very powerful demonstration effect. So from European, Polish point of view, this revolution, with one exception, which is the retreat from nuclear, which is a separate topic, we may look into a brighter future, and not only in terms of energy full stop, but also I would say that the more energy becomes a commodity, the more democracy will flourish.
So answering A as a Pole and B as a European, as you do so well, by how much do the Russians still have the Europeans by the, as we say in Spanish, cojones, or balls in English? There are some very interesting questions that some people pose as to whether the Russians are still dominant, central, and so on. And I would expect that the answer to this question is slightly different on both of your backgrounds, but maybe it's the same. Let us know.
No, I would say that the best for Russia would be the fall of prices below $70 a barrel. Below 70 there is democracy. Above 70 there is not democracy there. And that would be good for Russia itself. But that will not happen overnight. It is happening through the promotion of our model of or decoupling of producers and those who deliver. Alan Riley is here much better suited to speak about that. But if we succeed in promoting this approach of energy freely flowing within and outside of the European Union, we have also, in perspective, more secure and stable surrounding, and then one day perhaps the global.
The $70, I think, is fascinating as a number, as a democracy indicator. Most of the Gulf regimes seem to be making the, well, I'm not sure whether I should say the opposite bit or a similar bit, because they need the $100 because they want to fund the young people and get them job training and so on, which eventually in a Western theory helps to empowerment and leads to democracy. So would you advertise the same price for the Gulf states as well, or do you buy the argument that they need it a little higher, not to prevent democracy, but to bring social and economic development about, which is what they are currently saying?
I think that in a longer perspective, too high prices for energy produce stagnation. Arab countries are not evolving because they have the cheap resources from oil and gas. And the same goes for Russia. So it is not only slowing the growth in the West, I mean America and Europe. It costs our consumers, but it does have an effect on overall economic situation, including the crisis. But at the same time, it acts against democratic springs wherever they occur. Those who did and are happening in the Arab countries, in the Mediterranean, but also those who might happen in Russia.
No, I really agree with that point. I just want to remind the audience that $70 is where oil prices were in the summer of 2007. Okay? It wasn't that long ago. It was just the beginning of the commodity price bubble that burst a year later. So we're not talking, $70 we're still on historical real terms. It's still a very high price for oil. So going back to $70 is completely within my imagination and won't take a long time. It may be in the next couple of years.
And yet, combining your answer now with my earlier question to you, and with Jacek's fascinating $70 point, it seems, other than the Gulf states, the other country that needs $100 oil in order to do anything on alternative energy investments is the United States, because it does not believe in government mandates. So we have a very interesting alignment here that is not so apparent. I want to go to the audience in about a question or two, but quickly...
Very quickly.
No, Matt, I have a... help us also to get some business economics doubts onto the shale gas proposition right now. What, in your view, doesn't quite stack up in terms of the numbers, the profits, the yield on ROI, and so on, as in the pricing we hear in the United States that we're going to have a great manufacturing future because we may not have apprenticeships and training of manufacturing workers, but we're going to have cheap gas, and that's how we're going to defeat the entire West, and U.S. manufacturing is going to come back. So this is far from just an energy question. It's a very important question with regard to the entire resuscitation of the U.S. economy. But I don't want to limit it to the U.S. environment. I just want to hear business economics 103 from you on shale gas.
Well, I think on shale, I mean, the best way of looking at it is shale gas is not shale gas is not shale gas. What you've got is very different costs and geological features. So your cost of extractions actually vary hugely internationally, certainly between the US, Europe, Asia as well. In terms of the US position, Ed no doubt is very hot on this as well. It strikes me that the core problem there is that the price has simply dropped too low, and you see now with the EIA, it's massively downgraded what it thought it has as contingent reserves and proven reserves. So the US certainly needs gas price on Henry Hub to actually firm. Otherwise, a lot of that production that they have now will simply be mothballed. There's no way forward that they can actually go on that. Chesapeake is a classic example of where there's at. The smart play, I guess, the US will talk a lot about gasification of transport. They'll talk a lot about switching from coal to gas. That's all happening. But as far as I see it, that the real money shot for them is to start doing much, much more on LNG. And that's where some kind of global convergence actually might start to play out. And that is hugely interesting as far as making gas truly a commodity as oil is a commodity. That's the potential there could be enormous. The US could, if it follows suit, this is a political call, it could become easily the third world's largest LNG producer by 2020, behind Qatar or Australia, depending on where you see the top two. And it's purely under what terms the US decide to sell its LNG that could be so fascinating. Because if it's linking its prices roughly to Henry Hub, plus some kind of markup for global differentials, that's going to do enormous damage to the old method of oil indexation. And this is going to be keeping the Russians up at night. You mentioned about the kind of strategic control that the Russians have. Well, it's still totally pretty strong in Southeast Europe, Central and Eastern Europe. But the control they have now in Northwest Europe is extremely limited, precisely because LNG has been doing a lot of the hard work to break up oil indexation and actually get gas fundamentals based on gas. And that's hugely exciting.
Good. So we have a lot of collective intelligence in the audience.
May I say something? I want to attack you.
You can, but I want to make sure. But do that, and I'll try to give a quick answer.
We are accustomed to the price manipulation and setting by the Soviet-style economies, but I'm bewildered that this temptation happens in Europe, and in your propos, you say for technological advancement we need rather higher. This is typically central planned Soviet-style thinking about economy. Let's have more confidence in markets. Well, the solutions will be brought about by the markets, not by the artificial manipulation of prices of CO2 permits, and by, I don't know how, on the American side, keeping high prices to have the new technologies. Don't be so Soviet.
You know, I've been accused of many things. Soviet is not one of them, but I will say that the difference to respond in kind and constructively is that when you've lived with the US model and market model for 5 decades, as Germans have since they really became more part of the market economy, and if you've lived in the United States for 3 decades now, and you see the deterioration of American market capitalism into feudalism and rent-seeking by a very small number of economic elites, where you have the 1% literally giving student loans and consumer debt and housing and so on. There's a long history of how the market works least in the United States, and I think in Europe, with all the contending, Northwestern Europe, to pick up that phrase, with all the contending pressures, including on environmental things, I do believe that, as Hobbes said, all human beings are each other's wolves. I think the way we've found with government mandates is a constructive way to pacify humankind into the future. But I'll go to you in a second, but with one proviso. I asked, my opening question to everybody up here was, what's the biggest surprise that none of us are currently aware of? And so if that's a point that you have, I'll call on you first. Is that it? Okay, and then anybody else who has almost more a comment in that direction than a question, because I want to make sure that everybody gets involved. So please go ahead.
Okay, I just want to come back on all of the shale oil, shale gas thing, and there is a kind of surprise in all of this. And what I'm getting slightly obsessive about shale oil rig counts. And if you look at in the US, what's happened with the effect of very low gas prices is you see a collapse in shale gas pure play rigs. So in pure shale gas plays, there's a collapse. What you see, a massive increase in shale oil or liquid gas rig counts, where there's either liquid hydrocarbons or shale oil. And what we're seeing is the projections that we expected of, say, 4 million barrels a day by 2020. They don't take account of this massive increase in rigs. And the prospect is that what happens is that the date on which the US gets a significant increase in its oil production from shale oil and from liquids becomes much closer than we are anticipating. This is, I think, a potentially big surprise. And I think what we are then looking at is a significant impact on global markets. Remember, the US only takes in now less than 10 million barrels a day of imports. If the US, well before 2020, is delivering 4 or 5 million barrels a day, that would have an immense impact on the global energy markets, and the oil price would be below $70 a barrel.
So I will obviously I'll let you go on, but I want to have you address. You must be familiar with what James Hansen of NASA has been writing about the environmental implications of getting all that shale oil out of the United States, and so don't forget that dimension, so that we don't get into energy positivism alone.
There are lots of, but I was trying to give you one. I was trying to be short. I can be long if you like.
No, please. You can have more time if you answer both of those.
Well, I kind of, there's two things. One is that one of the reasons why a low gas price might be sustainable to some degree is because when you're producing all this shale oil or liquids, you get a lot of gas as well, and the gas is essentially free, you know. It allows you to sustain low gas price out of the oil. That's one thing, which I don't think we're taking account of. The second thing is the enormous degree of technological effort which is going in to deal with a lot of the environmental issues. I've been talking to one energy services company which is developing new technology for fracking, which massively reduces the footprint of the actual trucks and everything, takes out all the air particulate problems, deals with a lot of these issues. There's apparently some Italian firm offering modular water osmosis, apparently, which have huge effects on recycling. But all of that is happening. So a lot of the environmental issues which have been raised are one by one technologically being dealt with. And one of the things about all of this is that if you ask what is the biggest environmental issue with shale gas, you can argue it's the scalability of being able to deal with not one rig but 500 and having the regulators and so on. But I think the really big issue, and this is where I argue about it being a green package, the really big environmental issue is to realise the danger of gas complacency. In a world where we have huge amounts of gas, we kind of sit there. And the issue there is to wrap shale gas up in a green package so it gets us the CO2 cuts, gives us energy security, and provides a lever to move into a seriously low carbon economy. And that's how I think we actually need to adjust this. But Hansen, of course, is right.
And the technology firm you said is Italian?
Yeah, this Italian firm is apparently, but there's a British one doing it. But there's loads and loads of firms looking at all of these things, and that's going to cut costs enormously and allow you to develop a much. The cost path of the shale gas ends up much lower than we are anticipating. And the Henry Hub prices can be low, but people can still be making money and everyone benefits.
Right.
Right, I'll stop there.
Question to Ed in a global context quickly. One of the big surprises to me has been how outspoken the Brazilians have been with regard to deep oil and taking, I think, a former employer of yours to task, Chevron, which has been very involved in the Brazilian fields way out in the ocean. And now that you have severed your ties, are they doing the right thing in terms of being really tough on the oil companies? Because obviously the United States government has been doing very poorly, as we saw in the Gulf of Mexico. And it seems that there are a lot of contingent risks in this. And if the world leader on energy and previous standard setting is lax because it gets all lobbied away in the city of Washington that you also know so well, do the Brazilians have a point to be tough on big oil?
They do. And, since I left Chevron more than a dozen years ago, really, no, nothing I say should be taken against Chevron. But I think what that case, as well as the Macondo case, demonstrated is that when you have a high price regime for a long time, you go farther, deeper into frontier areas where the industry's ability to explore and develop far outstrip government's ability to regulate on safety and environmental grounds soundly. and that there was a catch-up that didn't take place in either the United States or Brazil. As I understand it, it was Chevron's error in the case of Brazil, and I don't know the details of it, but taking them to task is exactly the role of government in that case. The problem is the scale is so large that we don't understand how much it takes to move 85, 90 million barrels around the world per day. The entire Macondo spill was 4.9 million barrels. That's 6 hours of US consumption. Okay, so getting ahead of the curve is on the regulatory side, is a challenge for not only government but by industry as well. And there was a lot of work that needed to be done. It was a human and technological failure by BP in Macondo as well, and the fact that they're taken to task is the right thing to do.
Please.
From the Atlantic Council, the topic is the geopolitical implications of energy shifts. And at risk of being accused of being a Soviet by Jacek, can you give me an assessment of what should be the geopolitical objectives of, let's say, the United States and its European allies in managing these geopolitical implications? And to what degree do you see them actually thinking and acting in a way that leverages the geopolitical potential of these shifts you talked about? I mean, an example I would use is, can we use shale gas to kind of further leverage greater sovereignty for Ukraine, if not to pull it more to the West? But there may be better objectives that could be pursued through the management of these geopolitical implications.
See, the nice thing about an audience like this is one can always keep the microphone there. People here will give an answer, but the question I have to you is, can one do it? And should one do it? I mean, can it even be done? Isn't part of what's being set up here that there's such a myriad of possibilities that you almost can't control it in any sense anymore, and there's a lot of unpredictable and therefore constructive building of new coalitions? I mean, that's a question that I'd like for you to answer before we take it up here. What's your vision about it?
My vision is...
Beyond Ukraine, really global.
I think it's possible. If you can think...
But we don't, Ian.
Well, that's why I'm throwing back to the panel.
It's
what
possible,
can
but we
should, and if we don't, is it possible? And what would you shoot for, and how an outline of steps you would take to leverage that capacity? But to answer your question, yes, I think it can be done, but it's often harder for democracies working in market economies to leverage those kind of capacities, particularly when you're talking about multi-year, if not decades-long time horizons.
And isn't it, I mean, we have the one part that's missing in this panel here and at the conference a little bit is we have too few people from Asia. And I think there are a lot of dynamics that were discussed up here that would feel Asians excluded when we say we Western democracies should use this and so on, because I think in a lot of these countries this needs to happen sotto voce, because the energy question actually has an interesting way of undermining political regimes and bringing those societies to a more constructive future. And so if we pretend we have a grand plan on these things, we may be undermining our own potential in terms of using this for, enhancing the prospects of democracy globally.
To throw out an example. An example would be in the U.S.-Poland relationship. Energy security is a new pillar. It's the dominant pillar in the relationship. Shale gas is the dominant pillar of the energy pillar. It's being thought of largely in bilateral terms. Should they be thinking regionally about what they can leverage through this new relationship between the United States and Poland within Europe?
Jacek, that's a...
Well, your first question was, what is the geopolitical goal, or should be? The goal should be to have energy cheap and free-flowing and not being a political weapon. So depoliticizing energy and leaving the stage of today where it's energy which makes the world go round in terms of political influence. I could imagine easily that shale gas, if exploited in significant amounts, in Central Eastern Europe, would change the geopolitical landscape of this part of Europe, and with a consequence for wider geopolitics immensely. Imagine that Poland discovers and exploits and delivers cheap energy not politically bound to Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, and Kaliningrad region, and perhaps European part of Russia. We immediately have a geopolitical situation when Russia has to democratize or to modernize, because it can no longer rely on this weapon. So immense possibilities are there. The problem is that there are, for the moment, there are technological and other bottlenecks. I don't think that the Americans, besides giving technology, can do much on that. I mean, I don't see any immediate result from President Obama declaring in Warsaw that America will be supporting. It's the business who has to enter. It has to be economically viable projects, put into a sound regulatory framework. And that we have to do ourselves.
But what both of you are basically implying or saying or hoping for is that shale gas can be used as a tool to strengthen the forces of democracy and independence in this region against Russia. And yet the political economy is such that the democratic forces in various of the countries in the region are against shale gas right now.
I have a follow-up question there.
No, please. We want to have your...
Because of this shale gas prospects, do you, as business people, could you believe that this resistance to shale gas in Europe might be politically motivated or might be fanned by, say, the interest I cannot name openly now?
Why don't you?
Yeah, well, surely. I wanted to. right, yeah. But what do you think about it?
Yeah, but I mean, just to be true on Gazprom, right? It had a big stranglehold on
yes,
Germany.
Or others.
No, but let me just say, in Germany, used to have a big stranglehold over the country, and these days we most prominently know it as the sponsor of the soccer football club Schalke 04. So everything gets relative over time.
But not only them. I mean, Jacek says about this free-flowing energy. I'm not sure whether the big energy corporations in Europe are so much interested in the free market.
So the question really goes to Ed, who wanted to jump in anyway and who has the only legitimate claim of having been a businessman for a part of his life.
I want to respond to Ian's question. I mean, I think we have the possibility of doing it, but I question whether we have, one, the understanding or would marshal the capacity to do it. What we do is support principles at a very rhetorical level. What you're talking about is very targeted policy action. Just to pick up on your example of Ukraine. The biggest impediment to promoting higher gas production in Ukraine has absolutely nothing to do with shale gas. Shale gas could well be a head fake by the current Ukrainian government. The main barrier to increasing domestic conventional gas production in Ukraine, which has got plenty of geologic possibility, is wellhead gas price control. That's the biggest problem. When you are paying your domestic producers $50 and you're importing at $400, you don't get a lot of domestic production. I mean, that's the reality of it. And yet, when the IMF goes to Kiev and beat up any Ukrainian government, all they talk about are burner tip prices, not wellhead prices. Burner tip prices, which affect the consumer, are never popular on the part of any government. We together, Europe and the United States, have the single largest influence on the IMF. To do the kind of targeted policy action you're talking about requires getting one, understanding the issues, which we often don't, two, getting organized to influence institutions that we have influence over that have some impact in Kiev. We don't do that. we have the Libyan action, and 3 or 4 months later, the IEA responded. It took a long, long time. Now, no, in the case of Iran, we're talking about it even though it's not a supply disruption yet, and if there is one, that is in part triggered by European and American action. So the objectives, the capacity, and our actions are all mixed up, and that's partly because we don't have good information knowledge in the policy-making process, which is why for like this one is important.
I want to stay with a question that was just asked about Gazprom, and I see a lot of younger people here in the audience, and I assume quite a few of them are Polish. Does any one of you want to address the question of democracy, shale gas, protests? I mean, what's the societal level of debate here? I can't imagine it's driven by Gazprom. I think there's some generational issues. Is anybody wanting to jump in on that? Please do.
Rafał Ruczko, University of Wrocław. I have a question connected with a strong position of the most powerful and the biggest companies, energy companies in Europe. How do you think? Is there a risk that those companies will really create the European policy, energy policy? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, coming to that question, there's a huge misconception, and it's absolutely systemic in Europe, and we just heard it there. Energy should be cheap. No, energy should not be cheap. Energy should be cost reflective. That's something we've learned to live with in the UK. Cheap doesn't mean anything. Cheap means subsidies, and this is the Ukrainian problem. This is actually where we're at, and that's where we need to get towards, which directly links into the market liberalisation question. Utilities across Europe have absolutely no problem with whatever the gas price happens to be, as long as they can pass it through to consumers. It doesn't bother them one bit. The problem they've had with market liberalisation, and it's actually been far more European spot markets that have done much more than any legislation on this, is it left them out of the money, and the smaller market players were coming in and taking market share. This is exactly why all the German utilities are desperately trying to renegotiate their contracts with Gazprom, because they're all out the money, they're all going to lose market share. RWE stands a reasonably large chance of going under if it doesn't tie up with E.ON. So this is actually where we're at on this. I don't quite understand this linkage as well between democracy and a correcting oil price. What I do understand there in terms of the linkage is if the oil price goes down, what you will get is a lot of repression, a lot. We can see it already in Syria. There's no reason why the Russians would be any different in terms of just saying, fine, the game's up, let's have elections. They already have elections. That system's not particularly going to change. What I find also a little bit concerning is the idea that if the oil price corrects, and it relates to gas as well, we've already seen it in the US in terms of the correcting gas prices, all that supposed production we get, you will lose all of that if the oil price is at 60, 70, even $75 a barrel. For a lot of the extreme unconventional plays you're looking at, be Brazilian pre-salt, the Arctic, Canadian tar sands, all of that is instantly wiped off the market. And what you will get on the forward curve is extreme contango, i.e. the forward price will go very, very high indeed. So this is not quite as simple as, great, the oil price is corrected and we can still keep this revolution going. I don't think it's going to be anything like as simple as that. And in a way, if you got a correcting oil price, it would actually do the Saudis work for them, because there's nothing more than they would like right now is to totally scrub off balance sheets, Canadian tar, Brazilian pre-salt, and the rest of it. That's perfect for them. In terms of the geostrategic question, come back to Ian's point, and I think, the US needs to be very careful what it wishes for here. There's a lot of talk about US energy independence, and there's a lot of talk how they don't need the Middle East anymore. The United States does not need Middle Eastern oil for a very, very long time now. You import less than 15%. The United States' core role in the Middle East is guaranteeing global oil supply for everybody else, and ultimately, alongside the dollar, that's where the superpower status resides. The moment you relinquish that, ask any Brit about East of Suez moment, you become a very ordinary power. So I think that's something to really think about geopolitically. It's not just about the oil, it's also about the world role.
Yeah, the U.S. defense budget is largely in support of China's oil supply lanes, which is why, in a current account balancing sense, it is also financed almost entirely by the Chinese, because minus that, the U.S. wouldn't have the money. We have around 10 minutes left, and we have several issues up here on the table that we can spend the rest of the time with up here. High versus low oil. Hold on a minute. High versus low oil prices, or mandates versus markets. But before I do that, I want to find out who else in the audience wants to say something.
Hello, my name is Wojciech Kazanecki. I represent Lower Silesian Center of Strategic Studies, Lower Silesian think tank. And I wanted to address your question, because you've asked, if I understood the question correctly, what's the current state of a debate, political debate in Poland, reflecting the geostrategic issues on energy? From my perspective, the debate is highly, because I've done research on it, the debate is highly geopolitical in a sense that it's rooted in the realist tradition, which means it's very much realist on the notion of power, on the notion of Russia, the interest, defending our position, and so on and so on. So the security issue is at stake, and throughout all the political elites, Mr. Saryusz-Wolski is one of the representatives of such discourse. It's visible, it's present, it's there, it's in the media. However, there is one aspect which we are often missing when we discuss the issues of energy, and that is the issue of the infrastructure of energy. In Poland, it's not only a question of getting resources, gas, oil, it's also creating electricity, and it's also delivering the electricity. And in Poland, one of the biggest problems, and it's not as present in public debate as it should be, is the fact that the majority of the infrastructure, the lines that are sending electricity and so on, are 40, 50 years old. Blackouts that you had in the US happened in Poland, in Szczecin 2 years ago or 3 years ago, and more people are actually reflecting that sooner or later, yes, we might be energy safe, that we have resources, but the infrastructure is unable to secure the supply of energy. That's one of the biggest strategic in terms of energy 2020 policy, the European policy, in terms of securing, in terms of the consumer position. Me, individual, the business that I might be running, getting security of supply, not only getting the geostrategic big question. And I think this is something what is missing in Polish current political debate at present, because this is one of the biggest civilizational challenges that is waiting for us to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And before turning to Jacek, because he's been patient and there's a lot on the table for him, I do want to point out that it's fascinating in terms of our debate about markets, democracy, freedom, and so on, that the problem that you just addressed is Polish legacy, post-war lack of freedom, and all of those things. But the United States, in terms of infrastructure spending on utilities, has exactly the same issue, even though it is the richest, most liberal market, supposedly, and so on, and has certainly a lot of capital around. And I just want to throw that in with regard to the mandates and government question, because it certainly, if the United States today finds itself in a position that Poland, having been disabled and dealt with unjustly by modern history and making up for it in a glorious fashion, finds itself in the same position as the United States, that certainly gives me something to think about with regard to energy infrastructure. But go ahead.
Thank you. Very quick answer to Mr. Stopski's question. Who are adversaries of shale gas? Russians, Gazprom, a nuclear lobby, and Green. Some of them because they are bribed, some of them because that's their doctrine. I remember talking to Alexei Miller in my capacity of Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman, and I told him, go downstairs in the parliament and see the BMW hydro-generated experimental model given by BMW to the President of the Parliament, and he ran downstairs. And I told him, this is the end of your power. If we, West Europe, will have a new independent sources of energy. I would defend the cheap energy against my colleague. When I say cheap energy, which means as cheap as possible under market conditions. But now it is a monopolistic price. Monopolistic price by Arabs and by Russians and some others. and some big companies, oil and gas, start to be friends of this monopolistic market because they share they take their share in the monopolistic price by strange agreements with the monopolistic suppliers. And this situation favors the non-democratic regimes, like Russian, like Arab. And this is very clear. So the adverse, if you do not have this monopolistic rent, it is in favor of democracy. So cheap in terms of as market allows, energy means more democracy. More democracy means more peace in the longer term and more stability around the empowered West. How to do it? In order to have a non-political prices of energy, we have to go through the political phase. We, the consumers of the West, who have to take over from those who are outside and inside interested in monopolistic prices, install the regulatory framework, be it European, Atlantic, or global, and then finally energy will be non-political. And that's the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question? Go ahead.
Okay, there's one other point I think is just worth raising about all of this, is that whilst it's true that the real danger of low prices is that it will cut, you say, the Arctic and the pre-salt, and that's true. But I think it's worth pointing out that the whole point about the shale oil issue, and I don't want to sound obsessed about shale oil, is that it's actually, you can produce that potentially at fairly low prices. And one of the really interesting questions is that whilst, yes, it will knock out the pre-salt and it will knock out the Arctic, what it won't do is stop the gathering development of shale oil, which potentially is all around the planet. You know, the Paris Basin is one example. For example, there may be shale oil in Poland, China, and so forth. And one of the really interesting questions is we enter a lower priced energy world for a time, and how far that can be extended by shale oil. And that will be, I think, the really interesting question of how that changes the entire market perception. That could really have a major geostrategic consequence, but we'll see.
I think just so, Alan, that the audience understand this very important point, it is that the shale gas revolution has allowed us to learn not only, and also on liquids, has allowed us geologically to tap the source rock. Whereas previously, all of the conventional oil and gas that we've been producing has been the oil and gas migrating into reservoirs. We're now talking about tapping source rock, and that changes the resource base to much larger than we were ever able to do before. And the lessons that we learned, maybe because of $100 oil, we went after this stuff, are not going to be forgotten. They're still going to be there, and we will learn how to do it cheaper, just as we have driven the cost curve down for shale gas in the United States from what we used to think we need at least $4 or $5, we now can produce it at $2.50. So there are a lot of things going on that is important. I mean, you asked about surprises. I mean, it seems to me that one of the obvious answers the shale gas revolution has addressed is debunking the peak oil theory. And people haven't even come to grips with that in their consciousness yet.
The thing I would just say, which is as a mental image, to understand the scale of the resource base we have now, is to think of fossil fuel resources as a pyramid. And conventional oil and gas is just right at the top of the pyramid. That's where we normally get our oil and gas from. And what's happened, because of the US technology of horizontal drilling and hydrofracturing, we've now got a massive, massive shale base underneath that oil and gas, which we can now access. So the scale of the resource base has multiplied many times over from what we traditionally could access. And the point is both for the shale oil and the shale gas, we can access it relatively cheaply. And that is probably what geostrategically is the immense consequence of this is that the resource base is massively expanded, and it can be accessed cheaply.
And geographically distributed.
Because it destroys the 80-10 ratio. 80% of all the oil and gas in the world is in OPEC countries and Russia, 10% in OECD and China. Well, that was the pre-shale gas world. That 80-10 ratio has completely exploded. And that is transformative in geostrategic terms.
That's all entirely 100% true, but I do still think we have a very awkward transitional phase, and in a way that actually compounds it precisely because OPEC know the game could well be up. My own personal take in terms of oil price correction, I think it has a very sharp geopolitical resonance. If we do see serious downward pressures on prices, I don't think the floor will actually be set by supply restraint from Saudis or anybody else. What I think will actually set the floor is the political outages that you see in most producer states, because they simply aren't going to be able to cope with the $50, $60 world. So what you'll actually see is a lot of producer states go offline, and in a way that could well set the floor price as part of that particular process. That could well be the dynamic that I think we start seeing playing out in the next year. But other side of that, it's very easy to forget. If we were sat here 2.5 months ago, Ed, we'd have been talking about an oil price and an oil market that was borderline close to out of control. Brent was at $127 a barrel. Ali Niemi kept telling the market that the Saudis had lots of excess supply. The market clearly didn't believe that it had excess supply, which is why the IEA had to come in as a kind of warning shot. We could still be back there very quickly. We happen to be facing massive macro risk right now, the Eurozone, US dollar, but the Chinese still have huge room to bounce. So this assumption that the oil price is naturally going to go 70, 80, I genuinely believe we've got a $50 to $150 world right now in terms of the oil price, and anybody claiming otherwise is an oracle.
And we don't want to go into forecasts of oil prices because that's as productive as the dollar. But
it has a sharp geopolitical
But the interesting thing to me, of course, is that when the market was at the high level at 127, I think the one thing that changed was that the U.S. government, through the SEC and the CFTC, announced that they were going to do investigations into the trading practices of Goldman and other futures and so on companies on this front. So that's significant that in terms of the rent-seeking of financial elites in the United States, a stop was put onto this kind of practice.
That, and they bottled the Iranian sanctions.
Sure. So I started our conversation today by saying that energy is a Rorschach test in the sense that it reveals a lot about personalities and so on. And I think we've seen that in interesting ways today. What I've also learned during the course of the conversation is that it also tells us a lot about the history of where all the individuals are coming from, including Poland, Britain, and so on. I thought we had some really good points and things that for all of us are future stuff to think about, including, is $70 a democracy-enhancing or preventing tool? Including the fact that I thought was very interesting that contrary to the idea that high oil prices are good, I mean, I would certainly say are good to have environmental investments, but I think Ed's point that they may caution us in terms of going to frontiers that are just one step too many, I think is very important to keep in mind. And with regard to my European friend and colleague, Jacek, the question of markets versus mandates and what cheap really means, we're never going to resolve it. But the great thing is that there's so much more communality between the Germans and the Poles these days that it's fabulous. With that, I want to thank you very much, and you'll have a couple of minutes maybe to follow up with some of the participants up here, and thank you for attending this panel.
Thank you.